people are misled that repetition is the key to creating habits, they're focusing on the wrong thing. And they won't achieve what they want. And they're missing an opportunity. And they're wasting parts of their life. So by perpetuating that myth, you're causing people to waste parts of their lives. And that's why I say there's an ethical issue with that. And that's why I'm being direct and calling out the study, because we really need that tradition, that old notion of repetition to go away. And we really need people to understand that it's the emotions that you feel when you do a behavior that make that behavior more automatic.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of The Future of Work with Jacob Morgan. My guest today is BJ Fogg. He's the best-selling author of a book that I'm sure many of you have heard of, if not read, called Tiny Habits: The Small Changes That Change Everything. And he's also the founder and director at the Stanford Design Lab. BJ, thank you for joining me.
Hello, Jacob. It's so good to be here talking to you.
It's funny, we're both in the Bay Area, so I would say during non-COVID times, we could have easily done something like this in person.
Yeah, maybe we would go sailing, or maybe just hang out on the beach, or who knows, or maybe just whatever. But it's great to be talking to you just the same.
I haven't done a podcast on the beach yet, but that does sound like something that would be fun to do.
I'll be in Maui next week. The flights are pretty affordable.
Oh, I'm jealous. Yeah, I mean, now that travel is picking back up, lots of low-cost options out there. Well, let's start off with a little bit of background information about you. How did you get involved with everything that you're doing? I mean, you can even take us way back to how you were raised, where you grew up, and what your life looked like.
Yeah, so I grew up in a big Mormon family. I'm third of 7 kids, so like this middle child situation. And within that Mormon community and culture, so much of that is about optimizing your behavior. Stephen Covey comes out of that culture, Mitt Romney, Clay Christensen, the Marriotts, etc. And so it was pretty natural as I got into college that I was interested in human behavior. I mean, I grew up with so much. Even my dad would sit me down when I felt like I was 8. And my dad would say, "What are your 5-year goals?" And I was like, "Dad, I'm 8." But I'd play with it. I'd go on. And then it was about age 14 or 15 in his annual, father, whatever. Not an employee assessment, but in the annual Connect. I remember one year I said, "Dad, the only goal I have is not to have any goals. I'm just tired of striving for things." But it is pretty built into me and the culture I grew up in to optimize your life so you can serve others more and to help other people do the same. And so I'm no longer a practicing Mormon, but certainly that aspect of that cultural upbringing, I think has really influenced my career path, even though I didn't think I would end up here. Here I am talking about habits and training coaches to use my method, Tiny Habits, and putting it out there, trying to help people globally optimize their lives in this really simple, straightforward method.
What did you think you would end up doing?
I thought I was going to be a surgeon like my father.
Oh, wow.
Of course, being a dutiful Mormon boy, went on a Mormon mission to Peru, where I lived among the poorest people there and spoke Spanish almost exclusively for 2 years and really got a different sense of the world. And then came home, went back to university, and thought I would go to medical school just because that was expected. And at a certain point decided, "Hey, Mom and Dad, I'm not going to medical." Yeah, I took the MCAT. I did fine, but I don't want to go to medical school. I want to be a writer. And I remember my parents, because I was running and writing for a college community newspaper that reached 25,000 people a week. And I loved writing and I loved that. My parents were like, "Oh, you can't make a living being a writer." So I kind of shelved that. But did pursue eventually what really interested me, which had to do with human psychology and behavior. Found my way to Stanford to do my doctorate there, looking at technology and behavior change and influence. And about 10 years ago, I was at my Stanford lab. My researchers and I were no longer really interested in the technology piece of persuasion and influence. We felt like we'd done the leading work there and did what we needed to do in terms of saying, hey, this is coming and we got to deal seriously with what technology will do to us, for better and for worse. We became more interested in habits and human behavior independent of technology. So shifted pretty hard in 2010 and renamed our lab the Behavior Design Lab to reflect what we were doing, as we were looking at a new way of understanding behavior, a new way of designing for behaviors, and focused on the pro-social aspects, healthy habits, habits of productivity, financial security, and so on, which kind of brings me back to my Mormon kid roots, where so much of it was about health behavior and productivity and financial security and so on. And so maybe that is one reason I was so drawn to the space that I'm currently in. And I love it. I just love it. It's so great to, I love teaching. It's so great to teach and share what I've discovered through research and hands-on practice. And then I get emails every day thanking me, and people post on Instagram talking about how it's changed their life. So it makes me feel really grateful. But I'll really cross the finish line here, Jacob, on the upbringing. It makes my parents really proud, okay? Because they raised us to serve others. That's the mentality. And to help other people like this, yeah, it makes me feel great, but it also makes me feel great thinking that my parents are going, okay, we did a good job. He didn't end up to be a surgeon. He sort of is a writer. He's really a researcher and a teacher, but he does write. And oh, he's not starving. So hooray.
So when you were younger, or I guess even before you wrote the book, were you constantly running experiments and trying to optimize yourself or your life somehow?
I think so. I didn't think of it as I was always innovating and trying weird little hacks of things.
Do you
Whether
remember
it
any
was,
of those hacks?
oh, I mean, some of them were just like, oh, I want a kite. I'm going to make a kite out of this shopping bag and some sticks in the yard. And oh, we don't have string. I'm going to use thread. Or I'm in bed and I don't want to have to get up and turn off my light. So I'm going to run a string through eye hooks all the way around my room so I can pull it and turn it on, pull it, turn it off. It was just, just hacking stuff. But certainly in terms of my own, this is embarrassing. I hadn't thought of this for Jacob for years. It was probably fourth grade. Every recess, a couple people and I would just run around the track as much as we possibly could. And we had another student who would count and time us. Nobody was telling us to do this, but we would just, and it was a 220 yards. Oh my gosh. And Jeff Hopper would time us. And we just run around and run, just because we wanted to see how many laps we could do during a given recess. And I was very into the sports, and I fortunately was a fast sprinter, so I was the fastest runner in school. So I was into long jumping and sports and all of that, and quite deliberate about that. And then my dad was a big person that'd go to the gym, so he took us to the gym. And then I got into swimming in high school, kind of late for the game for a swimmer. I started at 16, but I knew how to train. And I've got these long monkey arms. Eventually I grew. So I did well in swimming. I ended up being a high school All-American within like 18 months, in part
Wow.
because I trained hard, in part because I had some good, maybe not coaches, ooh, sorry, Coach Robinson, but good colleagues, good peers who were excellent swimmers. And then part of it in swimming just comes down to your physiology. If you're tall and have
Yeah.
super long arms, and big lung capacity, you have a huge advantage. So, but optimizing that, I wanted the school record. I wanted our relay to have the school record. I wanted to hit All-American. And I really pushed for those things. At the same time, oh, this is going to sound terrible. You probably want to edit this out. At the same time, I wanted to be a valedictorian and have all straight A's. So I really pushed hard for that. And Jacob, fast forward, I look back at that, and I look back at what I did at college, working so hard in school. And honestly, I regret it in part because I missed so much of life. Because I was like, I'm going to achieve this, or I'm going to, study really hard, or I'm going to get the best grade in this class. And man, you can't really reclaim those years and those times. So yeah, it helped me. But man, part of me regrets being so obsessed about achievement, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that's actually interesting because I think a lot of people struggle with that just for themselves and even also for their kids. I have a 1-year-old boy and a soon-to-be 5-year-old girl. And, there's always that kind of balance of how much do you push yourself? How much do you push other people? Even as an entrepreneur, sometimes I have free time where I don't have anything structured or anything specific I need to do. And I always feel like I need to be working. I always feel like I need to do something else and that I shouldn't have downtime. I should be building, creating, achieving something more. So it's interesting to hear you looking back on that and saying that you have regrets because you didn't enjoy life. And any advice if you would go back, what would you do different?
I would, in high school, maybe not much. My swimmer friends were great and we all were into studying. So that was a pretty good fit, I guess. In college, I would have done more college kind of things rather than just be in the library constantly. Just more college things, college parties, more road trips, more things like that. In some ways, when you look back and say, well, excelling there allowed me to open doors here, here, and here. But it also means that, as you get older, in some ways, your life gets more complicated and you don't have those opportunities. But Jacob, there's one big exception. I did decide at a certain point to drop out of school and backpack around the whole world. Like just go around the whole world. And this is before the internet. It was before you really knew how to do it. But I had a cousin who was on board with it, and we just loaded up backpacks and we went. And we went western direction, following the sun around the world. And that was not about studying, but I probably learned more in those 4 months wandering around the world than any other 4 months of my life. What a learning experience. So more stuff like that, I think, would have been great.
And this is before Airbnb, before smartphones. So I can only imagine how you navigated the planet.
It was tricky. You would have to meet travelers, and you'd have to get tips from travelers about your next stop. And yeah, it was challenging, but we had sleeping bags in our backpack, and we knew we could sleep anywhere. We didn't have to we'd just sleep on the ground or in a church or something if needed. And my cousin is such a good sport, and we had a great time, actually. That was good. In fact, right now, my students who are at Stanford who are under so much pressure. With COVID and the class projects, and they want to go to great graduate schools and so on. Like one of my students today asked me about her grade. I said, I think it's going to be about this, but your wellness and your overall well-being is so much more important than any grade in any class. Yeah. And I hope she really believes me, because I think it is. It's not worth it to lose your health or your relationships or your overall well-being to achieve some goal that at some point in your life you thought would be a good thing. You got to reevaluate where you're headed. And just because you set a goal at some point doesn't mean you have to slavishly pursue that if your desires change and if there are better things for you to do, for sure.
It's funny you mention that, because I think in the news now, Naomi Osaka, the female tennis player, right? She dropped out of the French Open because of mental health. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, let's talk a little bit about your book, because I think that transitions very well. Your book is obviously about tiny habits, which I love because oftentimes when people think of change, they think of these big, huge things they need to do, and it requires a lot of commitment, and I don't have time. It's too overwhelming. But it sounds like the reason why you wrote this is to make change easy and practical and say that anybody could do it. So talk a little bit about the research that went into this book, and then we can talk a little bit more about why habits are so hard to change.
Yeah. Well, it started with me hacking my own behavior just over 10 years ago. About the same time my lab's interest shifted to human behavior, and not doing it in like a traditional way, but discovering that I could take any habit and make it super tiny. So rather than flossing all my teeth, just floss one tooth. Rather than doing a bunch of push-ups, just designed for two. And that was a hack. So just like me hacking up a kite or hacking up a string-based light switch, I was hacking my habits and found that if the habit was super, super easy, I didn't need much motivation to do it, which means I could be very, very consistent. And that was interesting. And new and very different than what I'd been taught as a kid, which is like, set this really high goal and use willpower and discipline to get there. So I was going against all of that tradition and was finding that with scaling it back and then designing it into my existing routine, like where does this come after naturally? And then by reinforcing it through positive emotion, I was able to create these habits quickly and easily. And the habits, although they were tiny, were not insignificant. They would grow or they would have ripple effects. And I started losing weight. I started sleeping better. I started feeling more productive. I started feeling, what would be the word for it? Just mojo. Like, bam, I can do this. Like more confidence, more courage. And it was just striking to me that by just doing a few simple things, and it was a system that I was figuring out, and it didn't take willpower, and it didn't take discipline, and it didn't take sitting down with your dad and declaring what your 5-year plan was, that you could succeed quickly, and that would really open the door to much bigger opportunities and much bigger successes. So then I started teaching it a year later. So I started teaching the method because I was like, well, this works for you, BJ, but maybe you're just a weirdo. Maybe you're whatever. And it worked for others. So I started coaching people in 2011 through email. And it quickly grew to be hundreds of people a week that I would coach on email. And then I automated parts of it, but it was still personal coaching. And that 5-day program, well, it was something James Clear took in 2013 and other people took and taught them about habits. And that program still goes today. And I have a couple hundred coaches who coach people. So I'm not typically coaching in any given week. I will at times. So I have trained coaches that do this. And it's super fun to have that kind of impact. And every week, in fact, today we'll have a meeting on the 5-day program. We'll look at all the results from last week. We'll see where we did better, see where we did worse, read the comments about the coaches. So week after week, we're looking at the stats and the results. And we're trying new things, not every week, but we're saying, well, what if we did this? Do we get better results? What if we do this? Do we have better retention? What if we do this? Do the people then succeed better? And I did a lot of that in the early days. And now that I have a bigger team, we're doing more of that to figure out what's the fastest way to teach people to create habits. And we're down to about a 35-minute experience overall. So the 5-day program only takes 35 minutes in total. It's like 15 minutes to get started, and then just 5 minutes for a handful of days, if that. And so that feels kind of awesome that, hey, with the 35-minute investment of your life, you can learn a lot about how to bring habits into your life.
Before we talk a little bit more about that framework, I'm curious what sort of habits this is for, because you mentioned people are tagging you on Instagram, they're emailing you, you have coaches. Are these for any kind of habits, or do these only work for specific type of habit?
What a great question. It works better for some types than others, but it can apply to any habit type. Health, anything with nutrition, physical activity, mental well-being like meditation, sleep, all those aspects of health. It works for productivity. It works for creative activities. Like one of mine, I'll just show you, is I am working with flowers every single day. And that's awesome. And it just makes me feel great. And so I've created habits, daily habits around flowers. It can work with relationships. So I have a habit of calling my parents, for example. The one area where I don't have expertise and I don't make claims is stopping addictions. So if somebody's an alcoholic or addicted to drugs, I say, hey, go find a specialist for that. Yeah, I know the tiny habits method can help because people have emailed me and told me so, but I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a medical doctor. So I just stay away from claims for that kind of thing. But for everything else, anything else that relates to changing your behavior for good, the tiny habits method can be an important piece of that. And usually it's the first good step, because then that opens up other things, either doing tiny habits a lot or stepping up and doing bigger things, because behavior change is a skill. It's a set of skills.
Yeah.
Just like driving is a set of skills. And so you don't start off driving on the highway or the Autobahn. You start off in really easy ways. You learn how it works. That skill becomes, you become more confident and you become more skilled, and you can step up and do bigger things. And that's how people should think about optimizing their behavior. Is if you don't have those skills, don't put yourself on the Autobahn and especially expect yourself to drive over 100 miles an hour and succeed. Start with the tiny habits method and you will succeed and it will have impact, but you will, if you want to, you can level up to bigger and harder things.
And it sounds like you can also use this for improving leadership, for example, or maybe dealing with anxiety yourself about work or deadlines or pressure, like you said, productivity. Okay.
Yeah, and quick examples. So in the leadership space, we have a coach named Kate Hand, that's her specialty, is tiny habits for business leadership. And then on the other side with depression, the Stanford School of Medicine pulled me in to be part of a research study using tiny habits for depression in older adults, and that has worked really well. Better than, from the physician's perspective, better than medication. So huge range, yes.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how this works. And it's interesting you mentioned James Clear, and I think there have been a couple other people who've written books on something similar, right, on tiny habits. Did this all start with some of your research and then people just built and expanded on that? Or are these just different methods of doing the same thing?
The way I see it, I am the originator. Yes.
Okay. That's what I remember.
The idea of shifting in small steps is not new, but it was not popular. And in fact, in 2010, my Stanford lab, we ran a conference about baby steps. This was before I had the tiny habits method totally crystallized. I had the early parts of it, and we were doing a global conference on how to help people change. And we called it, I think we called it Believe in Baby Steps or something like that. And we lost some of our funders, Jacob. They're like, oh, this is not, you're not thinking big here. We're out. We're not going to fund your conference this year. And I was like, no, this is a big idea. This is, nobody's really advocating baby steps, and baby steps works. So that to me is a pretty clear signal that it wasn't like widely evangelized. Yes, there was the movie What About Bob, and that was very, very funny baby steps, but I don't think people
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I love that movie. I love that movie.
And for people who don't know what we're talking about, there's a scene, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think Bill Murray was looking for treatment, and Richard Dreyfuss was the therapist, and he was trying to get Bill Murray to change his behavior. And he said, just baby steps, baby steps. And I remember those funny scenes where Bill Murray would just say, baby steps out of the house, baby steps down the street, baby steps into the car. And then he would say, hey, this really works, right? You just focus on those baby steps. So I love that. It's a great movie.
I should look up the writers of that. It's not exactly tiny habits, but the idea of, well, again, the idea of making incremental changes was not new. I mean, you could look at the Kaizen method. I worked for a Japanese
Yeah.
company for 2 years, and I think that influenced
Hmm.
me. I was the director of research for Casio, the watchmaker, the camera maker, G-Shock, etc. Kaizen was a big, big deal. So that was about 2000, 2001. And the idea of small but continuous improvement, I think, did influence me, combined with David Kelly was my professor at Stanford in the mid 90s. David and
Hmm.
colleagues went on, I mean, and he essentially taught me design thinking, but there was no name for it back then. So David
Yeah.
and one of my classmates went on to found the D School at Stanford. Those would be some of my influences there. I mean, not so much the movie, What About Bob, but certainly the idea of Kaizen, and then previously um, design thinking before it had that name, design thinking. And I think Tiny Habits is a good mix of those two, actually.
So let's talk a little bit about the framework. You said step one requires 15 minutes. So maybe we can walk through what this 5-day thing looks like, the 35 minutes for people who are watching or listening.
Yeah. So here's how it works. So in the Tiny Habits method, I mean, you can think ABC. I mean, I don't love clever acronyms like this, but it does turn out to be ABC. The B is the behavior, the new habit. The A is the anchor, the thing that you're going to attach it to that you already do. So if it's flossing your teeth, that's the behavior, make it really tiny. And then anchor it to brushing. So it becomes after I brush, I will floss one tooth. So anchor, behavior. And then you celebrate, which is something you do to cause a positive emotion. You self-reinforce. In the
Hmm.
5-day program, we've made it really easy to do. You go to tinyhabits.com and you sign up, of course, but what you do next is you go to this tool that makes it really easy to create the tiny habit recipes. So I had a development team create this recipe maker where you swipe through, oh, what new habit do I want? Do I want meditation? Do I want snacking? Do I want relationship? And within that, you pick a specific habit that's already tiny. And then you find, where does it fit? What do I anchor it to? Oh, is it after I walk the dog? Is it after I make my bed? What is it after? And so you get your recipe formed in that, and that's maybe 5 minutes. And you design 3 of them. So let's be generous and say that's 7 minutes. And then you figure out what your celebration is. How are you going to self-reinforce? That might be 3 minutes. And then you enter it into a form. That's the remaining for the 15 minutes to get started. So that's what you're doing. You're figuring out, what are my
Hmm.
habits? You're entering into the form so your coach can see it. And then your coach emails you and right now, probably everybody's getting a video from the coach. So it's one thing we're testing. It's like, hi, I'm BJ Fogg. I'm your Tiny Habits coach. I'm going to be helping you this week. And then you interact with the coach for 5 days. And it takes 3 minutes a day to do your habits and then to check them in. Maybe 5. I mean, not that long. I'm being generous when I say 5. It's really about 3. So when you add that together, it's about 30 or 35 minutes. And you've had an experience designing tiny habit recipes and practicing those recipes. And then you get guidance from your coach who's there to help you and on your side. And usually there'll be one of your 3 habits, because we have people work on 3 at once. Usually there's at least one you need to revise because it's not working, and that's an important part of the learning experience. So
Hmm.
there's a systematic way to revise to make it better, and those are some of the skills that you learn in the 5-day program.
So maybe we could take one as an example, like a practical one for a business professional. I mean, I don't know if any come to mind that people are submitting. Like,
Oh my gosh. Yes, let's
um,
take reading more. A lot of people feel like
okay,
they want to read more. So read more is the aspiration. You break it down and make it into a very tiny version of that. So it might be just read one paragraph in a book. I'm looking over here at a book that I'm doing that in. And so the idea is you don't read a whole chapter every day. You just read one paragraph. If you want to do more, you can. And this is something that people don't understand about the Tiny Habits method is if you want to floss all your teeth, you can. If you want to do 20 push-ups, you can. But you put the baseline really low. 1 to 2 push-ups, 1 paragraph. And if you only do one paragraph, that's a victory. Then you find, where does it fit? And it might fit, well, after I sit down with my morning coffee, I will read one paragraph in this book. So you get really clear in your mind. Where are you designing it into your life? What does it come after? And you'd probably put the book right by the coffee maker. So in the morning, when you go to pour your coffee, there's your book. You pick it up, you open it up, you read your paragraph. Bam! You feel awesome about doing that. And if you want to read more, you can. That's fine. If you don't, you close the book, you put it back, and you say, good for me. I am reading more. Now, that habit can wire in quickly. But Jacob, what it also does is you will tend to read more and more, not just the paragraph. And you will also find other opportunities to read more. Like like that habit will crop up in other parts of your life. And the key seems to be just to plant a seed somewhere and nurture it. And then that grows, but it also spawns other little habits like it elsewhere in your life for that kind of thing, like reading. And that would be one way to apply it. And
So,
yeah.
so for example, like I'm thinking of a personal example. So and people who listen or watch this show know I'm very much into chess. I mean, there's like a chessboard behind me. If I move my head, there you go. So I'm trying to become a better chess player. I'm playing in a tournament today, actually, right after we get off this call. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so let's say I do one puzzle a day.
Yeah.
But I know that if I do one puzzle a day, I'm not going to get that much better. Like my improvement's going to be minuscule. And what it takes to become a greater chess player or to better leader or better whatever is, at least in the minds of a lot of people, a lot of work, a lot of time. I need multiple hours a day. So how does the tiny habits align with something if you have a big goal or you want to see great improvement? Because it sounds like the assumption is you will potentially do more.
Yeah.
So if I do one puzzle, it'll lead to me doing 3 or 5 or doing them more often. But what if it doesn't? And I just do the one puzzle a day and I stop?
Well, that would be a signal to yourself, I think, that you really don't want to pursue that very much. And that's okay. And that's absolutely okay. What you're designing for with tiny habits is consistency of the habit, not the size. And behind me, I have some musical instruments. And so similar to chess, if I only play one scale a day and that's all I do, I'm not going to get much better. But I've created that habit at a time in my morning where I have a bunch of flexible time. And I can be reading the news, I can be walking outside, I can be just on TikTok. I've got free time in the morning. I've designed my life. So right now I'm playing recorders. I call them flutes. So now my flute playing will expand most days to 30 minutes, sometimes 40, sometimes an hour. And I've gotten a lot better. But some days I don't feel like playing much, so I'll just pick it up, play something, and put it right back and say, boom, I kept the habit alive, and I move on. So you would still do the tiny habits method, but you would try to find a spot in your life where the behavior can expand, where you don't have like a meeting 2 minutes later. So that's part of the habit, designing habits is like just like if you were planting a tree that's going to grow big, you wouldn't plant it in a spot right next to your home where it would outgrow its spot. You would say, well, you'd plan for the future. It's like, where am I going to put this? Yeah. It's going to be tiny. I keep it nurtured, and then it has the potential to grow. So that's how I would think of something like practicing musical instruments or getting great at chess or working out, any of those.
So the idea is that the tiny habit is supposed to grow and expand, not to stay as a tiny habit. In other words, the tiny habit is the gateway into greater improvement and growth. Okay.
And it happens really, Jacob, I don't have to push myself, say, okay, practice more this morning, practice more flute. It's like, oh, I'm going to turn on some backtracks, or I'm going to turn on some, piano lounge music and play along with it. And next thing you know, it's like 45 minutes later and it's like, oh crap, I better start my day. But I had a fun time playing and I practiced these things and it was a delight. It wasn't dreary. It wasn't hard work. And Yeah, so it's like that. Now, let me just be really clear. If you are doing a habit and it feels like drudgery, step back and question that and think, is this a habit I really want? And
Hmm.
if the answer is no, let it go and
Yeah.
develop a habit you actually want. Yeah.
I guess as a leader then, I mean, two things come to mind, right? So as a leader, let's say I want to recognize my people, do a better job of saying thank you. So maybe one small habit can be, when I show up to work each morning, when I grab my coffee, I'm going to find a coworker or a peer and just say thank you for the work that you did last week or the day before. And so that starts off as the daily habit. And then over time, what it does is it creates a mindset of gratitude, of service, of saying thank you to more often. And now I'm thanking more employees. I'm recognizing more people on the team. I'm sending out emails, to the team, recognizing others. And then another example came to mind. Let's say as a leader, I want to learn something new, right? Because
Yeah.
leadership is changing, work is changing. I want to stay up to date with what's going on. So again, maybe same example. Start off the morning, grab my cup of coffee. I'll spend 10, 15 minutes in the morning listening to a podcast about something new or watching a TED Talk. And then again, the idea is that it creates this ongoing habit where I'm doing this on a regular basis. I mean, would those be fair
Yep.
examples?
Yep, right on.
Okay.
And part of it, and this is why a coach, a specialty coach is helpful. Somebody like Kate who focuses on tiny habits for leadership. I mean, someone could guess about how do I show appreciation to my employees or get guidance on what really, really would be impactful. And let me give an example. Because of research in my Stanford lab, this is probably 5 years ago, we studied emoji and the impact of emoji on people feeling like on their emotions. I know, right? And what a fun project. And one of the findings was when a boss sends an emoji to one of their reports, it's seen as a little odd, but it has a huge emotional impact.
Yeah.
So if you take that and generalize that research out, then let's say you're on Slack with your employee and somebody says, hey, I just finished XYZ. Bam, get in the practice of sending like a few emoji out, like thumbs up and happy smiley face and the little shooting star, for example. And that's going to have probably bigger impact than you expect. I mean, your employee might go, whoa, this is where the big boss is using emoji. But that you're creating an emotional response. So the point is,
Yeah.
it's not just doing any habit, it's finding the smallest thing with the biggest impact. And yeah, we can guess and have some sense of intuition, but having an expert coach in that area can be super helpful because somebody may not have thought about the power of emoji in showing appreciation to their colleagues.
Do all habits have to be tiny, and how do you set that limit? So for example, maybe instead of setting a habit of recognizing one employee a day or 15 minutes of reading in the morning, maybe I start off and I say I'm going to do an hour,
Yeah,
which is a lot, right? So how do you figure out what
perfect
that
question.
tiny habit is and what's not too much?
Perfect question. The way to design it is to use the tiny habits method. So design it to be tiny. Know what the tiny version is. I'm going to send one emoji on Slack every time somebody checks in something positive. But if you want to do more, you can. And I'll give an example that's in my life right now. About a month ago, we ordered Hydro, which is a rowing machine. We had the concept too, and it's like, no, let's upgrade to Hydro. And I thought, oh, I'll do a little bit of Hydro, maybe not. But I started out of the gate doing 15 minutes a day of Hydro, which is kind of what they prescribe. And never really had to do a tiny version because I loved it. I mean, it was super fun. Yeah, it was hard. Like this morning, oh my gosh, kicked my butt, but it was fun because it was so hard and they make it interesting. So the key, and Jacob, you asked the perfect question. The key is what you do is you adjust the size of the habit to your motivation in that very moment. So if you don't have much motivation or capacity to do something in that moment, do the tiny version, like just get on Hydro and row once. But if you have the time and the motivation, then you can do more. And look at tiny habits as a way to get you started. It just so happens with Hydro, I've never done a tiny version of that because I've always wanted to do more. But for other things like reading a book, there's times it's like, I'm not feeling it. So I'm just going to read a chapter, say good for me, close the book and move on. So the key is it's not you start tiny and you grow over time. That's not the method. You set the baseline to be tiny. And depending on any given day, the level of your motivation, the higher your motivation, do more. But it might be a year from now, you're not that motivated, so only do the baseline. But then the next day, maybe you do, 20 minutes on hydro. And my hydro habit is going to grow, I'm afraid. I can just see it. Oh my gosh. I could see me putting a lot of time in, but I like it.
Yeah,
So
you'll be teaching your classes from the hydro machine.
my hydro machine, it's like, okay, let's get on the rower, everybody. I mean, we'll see. But if I get tired of hydro, I'll give it up and I'll move on to some other activity. So I
Yeah.
really think of habits as you evolve them. You evolve them over time. And just because you said at one point you're going to read every day, if that no longer serves you, then let it go and do something else.
Should there be a balance between the tiny habit versus your timeline or expectations? So, for example, like in business, right? Organizations always say we need to grow by, let's say, 2% this quarter.
Yeah.
So there is a specific expectation and there's a specific time period for when that needs to be met. So in my case, if I say I want to be a national master by the end of the year,
Yeah.
so like, do the habits have to align with the timeline and the expectations, or how do those fit together?
There is a process, and you saw this in my book, Tiny Habits, where you take any outcome that you want or aspiration. Those are both good starting points. Like, I want to be an All-American swimmer or a Grand Master. And you break it down into specific habits. And then you wire those habits in through the Tiny Habits method. So that would be the general process. Now, there are times you have to push yourself, and you may have to use a different method. And right now, I'm calling the flip side of tiny habits the big climb. Okay, so sometimes you got to do the big climb if you've got a deadline or a deliverable, right? If I have a huge paper that's due at a certain date, tiny habits may not get me there, right? So I
Yeah.
may have to, but notice that's a different process. And notice it's not a habit, I'm achieving, there's a finish line that I'm pushing toward.
Yep.
And if it's not something that lends itself to just incremental daily actions, then you might shift into a different mode and go, no, I'm going to do a big climb. And that means you've got to tap into willpower and discipline, and there are other things. But for most of the things, Jacob, that people aspire to, like I want to sleep better, eat better, feel less stressed, it's really about just daily consistency, and you don't have to do those big pushes, those big climbs. But there is that mode if there's
Yeah.
an outcome, just like in becoming Grand Master. There's probably, yes, tiny habits can get you started. Tiny habits can help you do things every day. But as you map out what the trajectory looks like, you may, and that's probably why you have tournaments along the way and chess clubs and coaches and all those things
Yep.
help
Yep.
on the motivation side. But notice that's a different process than tiny habits where you wire in these really reliable everyday kinds of things, and it doesn't take discipline or motivation to do.
One of the other things that you talk about are these golden behaviors. And I think they have 3 criteria, right? Impactful, you want to do them, and you can do them. Can you walk through where does the golden behavior fit into the whole tiny habit
Yeah.
framework, and how do you develop these golden behaviors?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. The golden behavior, as I define it, has those 3 criteria. So let's say that I want to be more physically active. I come up with a whole bunch of different ways to do that. I could walk on the treadmill. I could go hiking. I could run with my dog. I could go biking. I could row on hydro. I could surf, etc. Then you pick among them, which ones do I want to do? I don't want to walk on the treadmill. I know that. And I actually don't want to run with my dog because she doesn't want to run. So that's not going to work. Which ones can I do? And then which ones will have impact? And so, and you pick those golden behaviors that have all those, and you turn those into habits. So the hydro rowing is a good example. Yes, rowing has impact. Check. Yes, I want to row. Why? I don't know, because my partner was rowing and he loves it. And I was like, okay, and I've done some. Could I row? Yeah, but we had an older machine, well, a traditional machine, so we got a funner one, so it made it more interesting. And so that became then a golden behavior. Impact, I wanted to, I can do. So sometimes the can I do this, the ability component means buying equipment, buying gear. The flower
Yeah.
arranging habit that I have, I bought a bunch of vases and stuff. I bought clippers for the flowers. So gear up, get what you need. And then you wire those in as habits. And and so the golden behavior is the thing that you can turn into a habit readily. If it's something you don't want to do, bam, it's not golden behavior. It's not going to become a habit readily. If it's something that it's hard to do, same thing. So that's why I wanted to be very clear with people within the realm of productivity, nutrition, sleep, stress reduction, etc. There are hundreds of behaviors you could turn into habits. Don't just
Yeah.
guess. There's a systematic way to find what are the golden behaviors for you, and those will be very easy to turn into habits. And that's a big part of the process, is an, an important part of the process. When I say big, I don't mean hard, but I mean it's vital. Because if you pick the wrong thing to create a habit, like if I said I was going to weed every morning instead of goof around with flowers, that's not going to become a habit for me. I don't want to
Yeah.
weed every morning. I mean, it might be a good thing to weed, but I don't want to do that. So I'll just weed on
Sounds like
weekends and get it out of the way.
it sounds like you also need a little bit of self-awareness here, right? Because you need to
Oh
be
yeah.
in touch with what how you're feeling when you're doing it.
Yeah.
Because if you're just kind of on autopilot doing something, a year could go by, and then one day you wake up and you're like, "What the hell? I never liked doing this, and I just wasted a year on it." So you got to pay attention to your response
Yeah.
to the habits, right?
So much so. I mean, the number one maxim in my book, so there's only two. The number one maxim, meaning the overriding principle, is help yourself do what you already want to do.
Hmm.
If you don't do that, it's not going to work. It's like, oh, help yourself do
Yeah.
what you don't want to do. No. So find those habits that you want to do. And the next maxim is to help yourself feel successful. And if you do those two things, you're on the right path for sure.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and maybe one thing I wanted to touch on. There's this perception that repetition is what creates habits. That if you just do something over and over and over and over again, that boom, I'm going to have a habit. Uh, do you agree with that?
No, not at all. It's misguided, it's misleading, and not just misleading, it's unethical to push that idea. Some habits
Hmm.
can form very, very quickly. Let me grab an example. Um, I'm going to step away from the camera and grab a notable example. Okay, let's see. Here we go. Okay, once upon a time. So some habits can form immediately. You don't have to repeat them. Many of us use headsets like this. This was our
Yep.
habit. And then one day we bought, boom, this. Okay? How long did it take for this to become a habit versus this? For most people, it's like none. As soon as you used it, you never looked back, or you rarely looked back to this. This became the habit. And then some things, even though you repeat them over and over and over, may never become true habits. Think how often, a kid has picked up clothes on his bedroom floor hundreds of times. Did it become a habit? Probably not. The it is not repetition that creates habits. It's the emotion you feel as you do the behavior. So as you put in this new headset, and as you feel like I'm free and I have superpowers and the audio's better, that emotional experience, it's the emotion that wires in the habit of the technologies we use, or the ways we get to work. I mean, if biking gives you joy and it's beautiful, and you have an opportunity to bike and the car is boring and ugly, it's the emotion that will lead you to that biking one. But if the biking is cold and ugly and dangerous, you're going to have to push yourself to do it. The misdirection here, and I'll just be very specific with people, The study that almost always gets cited, people can look up for themselves on repetition. It's look up Lally, Lally, 2009. That's the study that so many people have cited saying, oh, it's repetition and it's 66 days. And you look at the study, and even just reading the abstract, without reading the whole study, you can see the study was not designed to show causality. And the data does not show a causal effect on it shows correlation, but it doesn't show causality. So the thing that people are citing and then they keep like repeating, like, oh, just keep repeating, that's not what the research shows. And I can find no research that supports the idea that repetition creates habits. And the reason I'm a little animated around that is because if people are misled that repetition is the key to creating habits, they're focusing on the wrong thing. And they won't achieve what they want. And they're missing an opportunity. And they're wasting parts of their life. So by perpetuating that myth, you're causing people to waste parts of their lives. And that's why I say there's an ethical issue with that. And that's why I'm being direct and calling out the study, because we really need that tradition, that old notion of repetition to go away. And we really need people to understand that it's the emotions that you feel when you do a behavior that make that behavior more automatic. So we're designing for emotions, not for repetition.
Okay. So maybe one last question, because somebody might say, well, that's great, but BJ, your method is about repetition, right? Because you're doing the same thing every day. Is the difference that you have that C component of celebration that separates it?
Well, you're being consistent. You're not repeating it to create the habit. You're being consistent. Like right now, one of my habits is I'm eating steel-cut oats every day, just raw. A tablespoon of steel-cut oats. And it's easy for me to wire in a habit like that, and I want to be consistent. So yeah, I'm repeating that because that's what I think is going to be good for my health, but I'm not repeating it to wire in the habit. The habit wired in within a couple days. It's like, there it is. So there's a difference between being consistent with the habit and being misled that repetition is the key to creating the habit.
Okay. I see what you're saying. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's actually a great way to wrap up, and hopefully it'll tease people to want to go out and grab a copy of the book. So BJ, where can people go to learn more about you, your book? It sounds like you have a great website with these little recipes that people can put together. So anything that you want to mention?
Yeah. Easiest way to get started is at tinyhabits.com. And the 5-day program is free. There's no upsell. There's nothing hidden there. It's just coaches that are kind and supportive and awesome and want to help you. And next level after that is the book, Tiny Habits. You can listen to the preface for free on the Audible website. I got them to pull 15 minutes of the book forward, so you don't have to pay for it. I negotiated for that for everybody. Those are good starting points on Tiny Habits. About me, bjfogg.com is a place to go. None of my websites are awesome. They do the job, I hope.
You're really selling yourself there.
Well, I'm just being honest, I mean, things could be much. I'm working on a lot of projects. I'm teaching, I'm doing research, I'm running a couple companies. And I want to set expectations low. My websites are fine, but there are better websites in the world. But there's not a better method for creating habits. There's not a better system for transforming your life. So I want to be clear about what I think I have underperformed on my websites and what truly is important for people to know and embrace. And that would be behavior design and tiny habits.
Such honesty. I love it. Well, BJ, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with me and share your ideas and insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jacob.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. My guest again, BJ Fogg, that's Fogg. Make sure to check out his book, Tiny Habits, The Small Changes That Change Everything, and I will see all of you next week. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want more content just like this, then please remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, my new book, The Future Leader, where I interviewed over 140 of the world's top CEOs and surveyed nearly 14,000 employees in partnership with LinkedIn, is now available. You can grab a copy for yourself and your team at getfutureleaderbook.com.